Morning all. Let's have a look at the encounter between Vishy Anand and Michael Adams in round 6 of the London Chess Classic. Both of these grandmasters I really admire, and they've been rivals in terms of age. They've been competing since they were juniors. I remember their matches as juniors, and Adams has been long established as a 2700 player for a number of years, since Kasparov era, and so with Anand. So they've been around the block. Let's see what happened. So c4 from Vishy. The English opening has been exceptionally popular so far in this tournament. Adams responds with e5 as if he doesn't mind playing a reverse Sicilian, a tempo down. But of course it's very different to the Sicilian, because white usually fianchettos, and it's not usually like a dragon slaughter type game, hack attack, not at all. It's usually about d5 control. So the extra tempo really changes the whole flavour of this, what you might consider a reverse Sicilian. Actually here we don't get g3 though, we get knight f3, which is provoking black to go forward. But Mickey Adams, he actually just defends his pawn. If he does go forward, those pawns are subject to being attacked later. You know, things like queen c2. The e-pawn is usually quite vulnerable. It may even be attacked immediately. Maybe it is even virtually unplayable. We'll check that out. It might just be theory. So knight c6 defending the pawn. Now g3. Okay, g6. And you might think, okay, has black played this unusually? He's playing now g6. He's not putting the bishop on, say, c5 or b4 to be a nuisance and then coming back to c5. The bishop fianchettoing is slightly unusual. On the other hand, if it was on c5, you know, it might be a target later. With the fianchetto like this though, also the d5 looks a bit vulnerable. If black's not playing for d5, will white get a good grip on that d5 square? In fact, with the bishop heading for g7, there's going to be no nuisance pin potentially if white tries d4, and that's actually what white tries now. d4 sometimes increases the frontal pressure on the d file, so maybe exploiting the fact that the bishop wants to go to g7, there's not going to be a nuisance with bishop b4. This frontal pressure on d5 has been increased. So we see now, after e takes d4, knight takes d4, a kind of very clean looking control of the d5 square coming up, the bishop g7, bishop g2. If we look at this, black is really locked down from d5 at the moment, and that pawn sits on that semi-open file. But will the structure be okay for black here, even with that d5 control in white's hands at the moment? Well, black has some play on the e file though, and we see that after castles, black immediately seizes the opportunity for rook e8. Okay, which keeps an eye, of course, on e4, at least pressure on e4 if white wants to play e4 soon. Knight c2, and now d6. Okay, now we see bishop d2, and you might ask, where are the breaks from black's position here in terms of pawn breaks? If white's got nice control, cozy control over d5 here, how can black try and generate counterplay? This next move signifies quite a lot in terms of the fundamental plan that black could try and use here. With a6, it seems a later b5 is desirable. Of course, there are certain issues making that completely unplayable at the moment, which have to be dealt with first. We see now rook c1, okay, which seems fair enough. Knight e5, and that c pawn now attacked is just defended with b3. And now seemingly quite a committal decision, but maybe making use of the fact the bishop's on d2, interrupting the d file. Mickey plays c6. Okay, so potential tactical liability or weakness, d6, you'd think, but is that actually exploitable? A gaze is put on that pawn by the queen now after bishop e3. But the bishop is a bit of a tactical target here, and that is made use of with this next move, knight fg4. Okay, now an interesting thing occurs strategically here. What if the bishop just goes to f4? What is the actual problem with bishop f4? Are there any interesting forcing moves for black? Well, maybe even outrageous move needs to be considered if they're forcing, like g5. But let's check that in the second pass. But we get a kind of little bit of an outrageous pawn move here after bishop d4. You'd think black doesn't want to increase any problems on the d file here or the d5 square, especially as he just played c6 to seemingly cover d5. But now black commits to the move c5. He's tempted to get that dark square bishop, and of course he's factored in the imbalances for both sides, giving up d file, d5 square in particular, and d6 as a backward pawn. Seems a little bit controversial. Okay, but white doesn't want to retreat the knight here. He actually, it might even fall into tactically knight takes c4, so it might not be an option, but we'll check that out in the second pass. So bishop takes e5 here, bishop takes e5, attacking the knight, and the knight just goes to that cozy d5 square. Okay, but now that pawn, is it actually exploitable? And black has got a break here potentially with b5, you know, to take and get b file pressure. And this next move shows an interest in that. Rook b8. This pesky knight is kicked back, h3, and now d5 is cozily reinforced. So in terms of d5 control, this is a picture of happiness surely for white, this d5 control here. Okay, black's got the dark square bishop, but you might think big deal. Actually, it might be significant that the bishop, along with b5 and bc, there's also b4, just to intensify grip on the dark squares as another option. Okay, but things are about to get radically different in terms of structure now. First, an exchange on d5, and now queen a5 hits the a2 pawn. Seemingly a pedantic move, but a useful move as well. Queen a5. What does white do to concretely defend the a2 pawn? He doesn't want to create more weaknesses and potentially weaken this pawn with a4, surely. Well, he plays actually rook c2. And now after bishop f5, I think some of us might be tempted for e4. But actually, without moving a pawn, just queen d2, attacking the queen. Okay, now the queen just goes back to d8 rather humbly, rather than taking on d2. After rook cc1, is this going to be a peaceful game? Okay, or not? Well, white seems to have increased a grip on the position with the queen on d2. This queen is now, it hasn't got any squares. The knight's covering these squares. This monster knight, it seems, you could argue it's a monster knight on d5. And what of black's dark square bishop? It's not really doing anything at the moment. We see b5 now. And interestingly, things do get radically different. Vishy maybe doesn't want maybe the option of b takes c4 with pressure on b3. He takes on b5. And structurally, that really changes the fundamental picture, because now black can try and work with the A file, and A2 might be a target fundamentally here after A takes B5. Okay, we see rook FD1, and now it seems with that there's a gaze on D6 underlying this position, and if maybe this bishop was kicked back, at some point D6 could be vulnerable with a knight retreat or knight moving somewhere. And also a forcing move available to white. Well, there's multiple forcing moves to kick both bishops here. There's e4, f4, g4, all these options are available to white to kick these bishops, and this next move seems there's a keenness to stop g4 in certain circumstances. But also maybe as well the dark square bishop, there's a positional reason as well. The dark square bishop would enjoy this diagonal, so if black can get in h4, that might actually be a nice positional move to play to try and undermine these dark squares. And Vishy invests a pawn move h4 to stop maybe h4 from black. So his play is designed around this bishop, making sure that's not doing too much. It's okay, it's attacking this pawn, but it needs reinforcements to do anything more useful. We see now bishop g4 eyeing e2, and now knight e3. Okay, threatening knight takes g4, which is that desirable for black? Not really. Bishop d7, it seems. Bishop f3, and like the queen d2 move, it's like not only the piece was evicted backwards, like the queen was evicted backwards, but we get these pieces taking over these squares which they've retreated backwards from. The effects of that psychologically, as if white's gaining territory and repelling pieces and gaining squares all the time. So you might think, well, g4's been conquered, a5 been conquered. What's going on here? Is black worse? He's still got that backward d pawn. Okay, he's got that bishop, and it seems difficult to exploit d6 here. But is black really skating on thin ice in this position, or does black have counterplay? The a file is difficult to get hold of here with that bishop across the diagonal for any a2 pressure. Okay, but this next move, bishop d4, threatening to destroy white's pawn structure. So knight d5, getting out of the way. And then we see b4, which introduces various possibilities, like maybe bishop b5, but at the moment e2's quite secure with that bishop on f3, another point of the bishop on f3, and the king can also come to g2, another point. So this diagonal at the moment is interrupted by the knight, so there might be a chance to sneak in rook a8 to put pressure on a2 here. That's something to bear in mind as well. Now this next move, rook c4, betrays the idea that maybe an exchange sack would be really good here, an exchange sack and then you're on f6 with knight f6. That would be quite tasty. These dark squares would be pretty dangerous for black, so the bishop gets out of the way of that potential exchange sack. So a bit of cat and mouse here, pieces being repelled all the time going backwards. What is really going on here? Well, the pawn structure now is much more fixed than before. Before it was fluid. We see these pawns kind of fixed now for both sides. So what will happen when both sides' structures are fixed? They have to be worked with optimally with the pieces. This rook really needs to get to the a file. White somehow needs to maybe work up something on d6 if possible. But with the rook here also, it seems, maybe g4 in the future could be a plan if h4's protected first. And we see the move king g2 actually, which maybe gives the idea there might be some interest in a later rook h1, if not just to cover the h3 square tactically if needed, but also g4 might be a possibility. But in this moment of the game, black does sneak in rook a8, and the rook has quite a few functional squares of use, as well as just eyeing a2. Knight e3 attacking that rook, and the rook moves to a7. And okay, white has to factor in the possibility of rook takes c5 as well. If the rook didn't move to a7, sorry, or rather black, he's protecting d7 here, so rook c5 might be an exchange sack as well in the future. For the moment, black's position looks fairly secure, and we see rook cc1, queen e7. Okay, inviting the queen to be kicked around, but no. Knight c4, actually threatening immediately the d6 pawn. This is indirectly defended with bishop e6. I think now knight takes d6, and we'll check this in the second pass. There's rook d8 or rook d7. Maybe we'll check that out in the second pass though. but it looks as though d6 is not possible to take with the queen on d2 here. So rook c2. Now this bishop kicks that rook back, or is it going to be kicked back? Is white going to use a pawn move? White does use a pawn move here, e4. And you might not think that's a major concession. It does mark out the d5 square after all. Surely that's in white's favour. It does weaken, of course, f3 a little bit. Bishop e6. Now another change in pawn structure here occurs. Knight takes e5. After d takes e5, okay, now black can actually potentially use this d file later. Look at that d file. Before, that pawn was stopping counterplay along that d file for a long time in this game, but now the d file is a two-way road in this position. One-way road to two-way road. On the other hand, c5 is now a major liability on that c file, and it's picked on with queen e3. And the rook has to kind of artificially defend it with rook a5 resourcefully. An otherwise strange looking rook move, but it's logical as well. Black also is keen at some point to double on a2. Bishop e2. The other problem with the e4 pawn, of course, is that this diagonal is no longer restricting any rooks from the use of a8 here. Now Mickey plays rook d8. Tactically, he's relying on, if white exchanges here and rook c5, winning that pawn, he's always got rook a2, or queen c5 takes rook a2 at the end of it. So there's prisoners here in the position, c5 and a2, the respective prisoners of both sides, kind of virtual prisoners. And we see actually the prisoners are exchanged off, as Nimzovich might write in my system. So rook takes d8, queen takes d8. The two prisoners are exchanged off here. Rook takes c5 for rook takes a2. But in removing a2, b3 is vulnerable, and black seems to have a threat now of rook b2 to put more pressure. But there's another set of prisoners here, b3 for e5. White can maybe take on e5 here. And of course that would have been looked at, and maybe then queen f6, and then maybe there's a sense of uncomfort, not being too comfortable after b3 is going to drop later, potentially, because the queen can't really protect that. You know, there's pressure on e2 as well, so the rook would go back, and then black would go after b3 with maybe rook b2. So okay, but we'll check this out in detail in the second pass. This rook takes e5. Now, if you remember back, not too long ago, a few days ago, there was a video on this channel, Logical Chess Move Details, which brought together various subjects on how do we check the threats, and the idea of doing what chess software does, give the player another move virtually, so you're not biasing the position with any move insertion yourself, and you can check the threats. But also, when it comes to doing your own move, you should always track down the weaknesses of your last move. And okay, if there's any move in the entire tournament so far which demonstrates the power of weakness of the last move, it's the next move we're about to witness. And strangely, or rather perversely you might consider, for a long time in this game black had a backward d6 pawn, so the idea of this even being two-directional road wasn't even evident for much of the game. It was white's pressure on the d file, not black using the d file potentially. So bear that in mind psychologically. Black had a long time a backward pawn on the d file and was unable to use the d file. Now this weakness of the last move, so say you do consider what your opponent's threat is, and then you try and work out variations, but and you're considering a move, and you might think it's absolutely brilliant. It cuts across the Nimzovichian exchange of prisoners. You don't want to exchange off B3 for E5 indirectly or otherwise. You might be thinking the opponent's got some play you don't like, which is irritating, uncomfortable. So you've got this brilliant concept in mind, and you play this move which seems to achieve these absolutely stunning goals. So you might have even spent an hour on it, but in playing your move, in any move, there's a from and a to. Where a piece comes from, it was already guarding squares. Where a piece goes to, okay, then it becomes part of your brilliant conception that you might spend ages on. Now this next move is an absolute shocker. I wonder if you can guess what Vishy played here if I give you 10 seconds starting from now. Okay, he doesn't want this exchange of prisoners with rook e5, it seems. He plays bishop c4, which seems brilliant. Why not just keep the pressure on e5, or even come back to that later, you know, after taking b4's weak, and then maybe queen c5 later potentially. Okay, keeping an eye on f2, of course. So on the surface it looks brilliant. Yeah, great. Not just play the ordinary rook takes e5, but there's a problem technically with this move. Where did the bishop come from? What squares were it covering? Was it covering? Is there a weakness of the last move? The bishop came from e2. Okay, what was it covering on e2? Can you see Black just technically exploiting now the weakness of the last move? If I give you 10 seconds here, you might want to pause the video. So starting from now. Okay, now Adams during the stream he spent ages, it was evident he spent ages checking this next move. It does need quite a lot of checking. It's based on technicality, and it's based on perversely the d file, which wasn't even a two-way road in the game for much of the game. So psychologically these things, I think as humans, they build up these biases that for hours during the game this road wasn't two-way, and now all of a sudden it can be exploited by Black. And the move which exploits the weakness of the last move is Queen d1. The bishop's just come off the protection of d1. And you might think, what on earth is this? What on earth is this? Surely you can just damage Black's pawns with bishop takes e6. But in chess you don't need to recapture routinely. You have options. And the problem with bishop takes e6 would be rook a1. We'll check this out now briefly, but then we'll switch later to engine view. Now here Black doesn't have to recapture. There are also various checks to factor in. Well, bishop f7 check and rook c8 check. But here Black has time to threaten mate, to sneak in without recapturing rook a1 to threaten queen h1 mating, if this had been the case. And the checks don't really help. For example, bishop f7. Okay, the queen's also threatening queen h6, so forget king f8 and queen h6. But Black has a move here, king g7, to avoid any dangerous checks. And the bishop's actually shielding the king on the 7th. And the queen has no useful entry to h6. Safe as houses for the Black king, and Black's still faced with this horrible mate threat. And you might think, well, hold on, surely, okay, maybe is there a way out with the king if nothing else? or G4 F3. Well, King F3. If White tries King F3 here, well, that's an illegal move. Pardon me. We can't play King F3. I think I had hallucinated that during the stream. That's why I was trying it now. I thought, okay, so there's no escape with the king. Let's try G4. Well, on G4, just check, and Rook G1 is mate. Let's look at the game continuation now. And you might think, well, hang on, Rook C8, surely Rook C8, does that do anything? No, King G7, and there's no useful checks again. You can try Rook G8, there's no Queen sack, there's nothing. So there's the same scenario here. What about this bishop, you might think? Doesn't really help. It doesn't really help matters. There's still Queen H1 as a threat. What about F3? Hold on, F3 in this position. Check. Then Queen H2 is mate. Oh dear. The checks really don't help White. This non-routine capture is actually possible. To just play Rook A1 instead. But it all stems from this weakness of the last move, this whole construction, this tactical construction here, left a slight chink in White's armour for that moment, that transient moment in time, that chink in the armour, which for hours during the game, it wasn't even an asset for Black to use that D file. All of a sudden it's pounced on with Queen D1. Remarkable. The cruelty of chess is staggering, absolutely staggering. You're tricked into thinking these resources, are not really going to happen. But okay, so Queen D1 was played, and Vishy tries Queen H6, a little tactical test for Adams, 2700 GM. So the tactical test here is how to finish White off. I wonder if you can take this test if I give you 10 seconds in this position, starting from now, or you might want to pause the video. Okay, little tactical test. The forcing move, Bishop H, free check, gives Black the extra time needed. So, what is going on here? Well, if King H2, then Rook takes F2 check, King takes Queen H1, mate. Okay, so that doesn't help. So if the king now hasn't got too many options, if it takes, then there's Queen H1. Okay. Now, what I find a bit cruel as well about chess is that Anand has the guts to play chess because he loves chess and he carries on playing chess. I think it does require guts and determination to try and achieve longevity in chess, not just win a tournament and then retire, not just put yourself on the line. And I know that I was myself, just thinking, do I want to put myself on the line even in the FIDE Open? But I had some other issues. But he's putting himself on the line all the time, and people are criticising him as if Anand should retire. I think it's really unfair, to be honest. Some of the comments I've been hearing about Anand, just because he blunders in this game, he's got a number of good years if he wants. If he can take all the criticism, if he does blunder, why can't he enjoy the game? Why can't people enjoy the game at whatever their level they're at without having this constant criticism in the background from people that are not even playing chess, they're just spectators? I think I've seen some negative stuff basically, which I didn't really like, and I think credit to both players. And what about Adams? He got beaten up really badly last year. He lost 5 games in this case. He didn't win a single game. He lost even to the fellow English players who weren't the super GMs. He lost to Nigel Short and Luke McShane, but he's come back with a vengeance this year. So credit for both players. You know, play the game. Whatever happens, whatever happens. Put yourself on the line. And I just don't like the criticism around Anand at the moment, just because he blunders in this game, or his draws. You know, at least he's playing. But anyway, that's on the side. Let's check this game out in the second pass now. Let's flip the board and check it out from the beginning. Okay. So C4. So from Adam's point of view, he's playing reverse Sicilian, and he doesn't mind White's control of D5. So both sides Fianchetto, and then this early D4. So White's getting a very cosy use of D5 here. Both sides down castle, rook E8. So the major dynamic imbalance for a long time was Black having the dark square bishop against White's control of light squares. In particular, D5 was in White's possession. But along with that was a radical backward D-pawn structure. So we see here a backward D-pawn structure, and it seems unimaginable during the course of the game that a decisive blow would land with Black using the D-file later, as we had witnessed. So rook B8, H3 knight F6. Okay, so knight CE3, just reinforcing the knight. And yes, let's start checking now with an engine. From an engine point of view, Black's doing okay here. Was there any minor slip up from an engine point of view, just out of interest, or is this all theory? In fact, if we just rewind out of technical interest here to the move, this position was actually E4. Let's do a reference check here. Was actually E4 being played before? So I'm just building up a reference check from this position. Okay, so the move knight B6 is the most common. 7,000, no, more than 10,000 games, 11,000 with knight C6. The next popular is 1460 games, D6. E4 is only 319 games. So the most popular move by far was played knight here, knight C6. Now D4, G3 is the most popular move in this position, followed by E3. G3 with 6,000 games, E3 with 2,000 games. Move G3, okay, and we see what I thought was looking slightly unusual was G6 later in the game. But here, actually, the most common move in this position is this breakout with D5 in this position. So it seems there is something radical about Black's opening strategy, because D5 would give Black, you know, use of that D file potentially quicker. And it is the most common move. 2,162 games I've got here with D5. The next most popular, bishop B4. The bishop is rare for it to fianchetto like this. Or bishop C5, 944 games. So that confirms my intuition about this position, that D5, bishop B4, bishop C5 were the most common moves. G6 has been played before, and it's being played by players like Kramnik, Backrow, Ivanchuk, Kopian to play G6. So it's a plausible move. Okay. Most common move here, bishop G2. It's been played by, in the past, Gurevich, Karpov, Galvan, Bariev, bishop G2, or D4. Pardon me, D4 has also been played by Karpov, Vitskov, Georgiev before, Korchnoi. D4 in this position. But the most popular little bit is bishop G2, not D4 immediately. But D4 immediately is also popular. So we're talking 304 games for bishop G2, 139 for D4. Black taking is the most common thing to do here, virtually the only thing. Knight takes D4. Bishop logically goes to fianchetto, as implied before by G6. Now here, actually, the most common move is taking on C6 in this position. Karpov, Timon, Onischuk has played that for Ghanaian. Bishop G2 is also a common move though. Bishop G2 just not exchanging. Okay, black castling, white castling, most common moves. Now rook fe8 is the most common move here for black, not taking on d4, just rook to e8. Back row, Kopian, Romnishin played this before. Rook e8. White's retreat is the most common move, knight d4 to c2, getting out of the way of tactical ideas for black. d6, the most common move here. Now in this position, e4 and the move b3, we're down very much down now, 11 games each for e4 and b3, but bishop d2 maybe slightly more unusual. Bishop d2, we're in slightly unusual territory. Apparently Spassky's played this position before and he's played bishop d2 in 1998. So Spassky back row, which was a draw. So we're kind of out of theory from here. Bishop d2, we're running out of the roads, the normal roads. So a6, okay, let's go back into the game. So for the moment, an equal position. Rook c1, knight e5, b3, c6, which the engine kind of likes. c6, bishop e3. Now this forcing move is kind of liked by the engine, just try and grab that bishop. So why not, well, bishop d2 or bishop f4? If bishop f4, let's just check that out. Wow. Wow. There's actually a threat on c3 here, a loose piece. Look at this. Can you spot it? 10 seconds. Knight takes h2 because of this idea of check, and bishop takes c3. So actually that's not even playable. So bishop d2 is an option, or bishop d4 as played. But actually the engine prefers bishop d2 to bishop d4. It likes c5 here, getting this dark square bishop. So from an engine point of view, it's no big deal, this position, to have the backward pawn for that dark square bishop. Okay, it isn't seemingly enjoying the diagonal, but this d5 control is as a major concern in return. So we see rook b8, h3, knight f6. Because of the dark square bishop at the moment, it looks as though, from an engine point of view, it's better for black, incredibly. And you might think, well, hang on, what are the actual threats and forcing moves here? Black's threatening knight takes and then b5 in this position, it seems, immediately. That's the immediate thing. And what if white tries f4? Is that ridiculous? Is there just bishop b2? Bishop b2 will do here, because the bishop hasn't got too many squares, because I'm just thinking the knight has stopped its retreat. Now rook b1 in this position, knight takes is possible, and then there's nice looking possibilities. Takes here, knight c3 on e2, so that justifies the rook on e8. If bishop takes, the bishop can now safely retreat back, bishop g7, with a nice position. So forget f4 as a forcing move, just in case you're interested. Knight c e3, and we saw now taking. Now queen a5 was played. Why on earth was queen a5 played and not b5? What is white actually threatening? Not much. Can b5 actually be played in this position, you might think? Possibly. But queen a5, okay, does threaten the pawn. Rook c2, we saw bishop f5. So white's trying to, I think really the idea is to provoke e4 to close up this diagonal to the bishop, so that later you know, there's more squares available to the rooks without worrying continually about this diagonal. If e4 would be a sort of concession, it would be a concession. So queen d2, one of the strongest moves here, only moves really. The queen just stumbles back to d8, and you might think, what was the point of all that? to get this position. Still, black's doing okay. I guess it can be called cat and mouse. The rook just goes back now, it is friend. And now we see b5 anyway, so why not b5 immediately? Is the queen slightly worse on d2? Maybe Adams thought the queen was slightly worse on d2 than d1. There's a nuance here, clearly. Okay. C takes b5 is played here, which is a little bit committal for this A file. And it does also emphasize b3 as a potential target later. Okay, what can white do instead? You can sit back and just wait, I think, for an exchange on c4. I don't think this would be too harmful, surely. That would be about equal. So I don't really know. Black can just wait here, doesn't have to move this pawn or take. But anyway, c takes b5, changing the structure again radically, and it seems to be in black's favour more technically from this certain depth, that the A file might be, perhaps the argument is the A file here, the underlying tactics are to do with the A file, which seems to give black something. So h5, was white actually threatening anything at all, like g4 in this position? Knight e3, no, knight f4, no, there was no actual threat against the bishops. But h4 does seem to carry the threat of h4 now. That is one of the threats of h4, and that is dealt with h4 from white. Bishop g4, threat. I think there is a threat on e2. Let's see. Or is it bishop d4? Bishop d4. Okay, because then e3 is more painful to play. So anyway, that bishop's kicked. It goes back to d7. Right. And now bishop f3. So again, taking squares. It seems, you know, white's been doing some logically pleasing things to take over squares from pieces that have been evicted back. But structurally, if black can start using that A file, it's going to be interesting. Bishop d4. Was that a slip up? Not entirely sure. What is the actual threat of bishop f3 now? Is it just knight d5 again without bishop g4? Possibly. So we see bishop d4, knight d5. Now b4, very committal move, but the engine likes it. Shutting down these two pawns, fixing them. Okay, rook c4. I'm pretty sure there looks to be a threat of rook takes d4. If white's given another move, rook takes d4 is a threat here indeed. That's gotten out of the way with bishop e5. King g2. The rook goes to a8 now, while it can. Knight e3 attacking the rook. The rook goes to protect d7 just in case. Goes there. Rook cc1. For the moment, black's doing okay. Queen e7 looks a bit weird because it's like inviting a knight d5. Why would you want to play queen e7 in this position? What is white actually threatening here? Knight c4 potentially. Okay. So queen e7. Maybe he's just inviting a repetition. I don't know. So knight c4 is not going for that knight d5. Is offering up the dark square bishop. So we're going to see a change in structure yet again. So the imbalances, which were d5 for the dark square bishop, are now morphing again into pawn weaknesses on both sides. a2 for c5 coming up. So the dark square bishop is about to go. But first e4, which the engine does recommend here, just to kick the bishop and then take on e5. It doesn't seem such a big deal. About equal again. Queen e3 might not be the most accurate, or it seems absolutely okay actually. It seems 0-0. So it's, in this position it was absolutely okay, it seems, technically at this depth, which has let this run a bit, depth 19, absolutely okay. So we see the pawn being protected though, not pushed or anything. Maybe another option was c4, more tactical than the game. So for example, c4 takes like this. Okay, but this seems fair enough, absolutely fair enough. Rook a5, bishop e2. So absolutely dead equal here. But psychologically, of course, computers are not saying, well, you know, for hours the d file was in white's possession and now it's a two-way road. The computers don't care about that at all. The history of the game, what's built up as a sort of bias, is not relevant at all. It's the exact position now. So rook takes d8, queen takes d8, and again, seems absolutely okay. Rook takes c5, first exchange of prisoners. And now rook takes e5, just accepting any potential issues with rook takes e5, which wasn't played, is the top candidate at the moment. Let's have a look now at rook takes e5. What's the problem with rook takes e5? Now queen f6 or queen d2 as tries for b3. So black is a pawn down. He has to get his pawn back, and it's not that easy actually. I mentioned rook b2, but then maybe indeed that's not good enough. Maybe rook b2 is not actually good enough here. If rook b2, now bishop c4 is a really powerful move in this position. It seems white will be doing fine here in this particular position. It's funny that with the rook on b2, how different that is. So let's try the queen f6. Now here, okay, if rook c5, tactically black can get back the pawn with bishop takes b3 because of this decoy of the queen away from deflection, away from protecting e2, and then f2 is a target. Queen will go back and we're looking surely drawn position. This ending looks to be heading for a draw. Check b3. It looks okay, absolutely draw scenario. So rook takes c5 looks to be, if we go back after this, rook takes a2, rook takes e5. What about queen? Is queen d2 an issue in this position? Just taking, okay, it's on the bishop, bishop c4. This scenario should be a draw as well. Okay, so in the game, yeah, we see this howler. We see bishop c4 and we see the evaluation going from 0 now to -7. And that's real cruelty in chess. That's amazing that so many, so just one move can be so powerful. Queen d1, queen d1. What can white do here? It's gone because there's a very fast threat of bishop h3 among other things. Okay, so in the game we see queen h6 and then mating free with bishop h3. Vishy's move queen h6 actually sets quite a nasty trap if bishop h3 isn't played, and we'll check this out with an engine, but maybe also it's a nice tactical test. You see that the mating free with bishop h3, you might think, well, okay, what about rook a1 though? I wonder if you can spot what would happen if rook a1 was played. if I give you 10 seconds starting from now before we reveal it. So rook a1 seems as though, because c8 is actually covered by the bishop here, it would seem. So it's not as though rook c8 is actually threatening to mate black because of bishop takes c8. So what would happen on rook a1? 10 seconds starting from now. Okay, rook a1 is actually a disaster. It's a complete disaster in its own right, because rook c8 is not ruled out. Rook c8 check, offering the rook, and after bishop takes, forced, there's queen takes g6 here, using that pin. The brutality of chess. One move would be away from victory or defeat if rook a1 had been played to allow that forcing move. Rook c8 check, and black is the one getting mated here. It's all pretty forcing moves, so it's good that Mickey is able to sleep by playing the correct continuation. Okay, so that was the final trap of the game there, set by queen h6. Quite a nasty one as well. So it's a nice it's a nice try really if rook a1 was played instead of bishop h3. So another little lesson there. If you're going to attack the opponent's king, it's good to run with checks, not to give the opponent any chance for forcing moves, to get forcing moves in, because they could be absolutely deadly, as is here the case, especially with the queen lurking around the king. I hope you got something out of this. I know it's pretty detailed, but that's the way I like it, because I want to try and learn stuff as well. I want to push myself to the limits, see what's going on behind the scenes. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.